Ezra Norik sat against the cold, metallic wall of his cell, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. His gray hair, wild and unkempt, contrasted sharply with the sleek, sterile surroundings of the Vrekian warship. The walls of the prison cell were bare, save for a single blinking light above him, but Ezra didn't need decoration. He had been in worse places, on worse ships, under worse circumstances. Age had taught him the value of patience. Through the small window of the cell, Ezra could see the deep expanse of space stretching out in front of him, a vast canvas of stars. He could almost hear the hum of the ship's engines, a reminder that the Vrekian Empire was still moving, still conquering. But they had made a grave mistake by capturing him. They didn't understand humanity. Not at all. The doors slid open with a hiss. A pair of Vrekian soldiers entered, their reptilian eyes narrowing as they looked him over. They weren't here for pleasantries. Behind them, the figure of Supreme Commander Krall appeared, towering and imposing. His massive frame filled the doorway, his presence radiating power. His face, a scaly mess of jagged features, twisted into what might have passed for a smile, if it weren't so unsettling. "Well, well," Krall said, his voice a low, guttural growl. "The famous human strategist. Ezra Norik, the old soldier." His eyes glinted with mockery. "I expected more from you. You seem fragile." Ezra raised an eyebrow, his face impassive. "Is that all you've got? You can take a seat and talk if you'd like. But if you're here to execute me, I'd appreciate a little more flair." Krall's smile faltered. "Do you not realize the gravity of your situation? You, a relic captured in our domain by my forces. A war hero, reduced to nothing more than a prisoner." He stepped forward, towering over Ezra, looking down at him with disdain. Ezra didn't flinch. "I realized the moment you made a mistake in thinking that I was easy to catch. You should know by now, humans don't go down without a fight." One of the soldiers let out a low laugh, a rasping sound like scraping metal. Krall, however, was not amused. "You think your species can defy the might of the Galactic Empire? You're nothing but a nuisance, Ezra. An insect that buzzes for a while before getting crushed." "Is that so?" Ezra replied, his tone almost bored. "You can crush me all you want. But what you won't realize, until it's too late, is that humans always leave a mark. Even when we're beaten. You'll learn that the hard way." Krall's eyes narrowed, the mocking glint replaced with something sharper, something more dangerous. "I've heard about your kind. You have a tendency to surprise, to outthink your opponents. But you're alone now, old man. And I'm not one to be outwitted." Ezra's lips curled into a faint smile. "Funny, Krall. I always thought arrogance was the first sign of a losing strategy. You've got all the resources, all the firepower. But you know what you don't have? A clue." Krall's fingers twitched. He was visibly irritated now, but he held himself in check. "Perhaps I should just have you executed. You've lost your usefulness." "Maybe," Ezra said with a shrug. "But you should know that when you kill a soldier, there's usually something left behind, an idea, a spark. I'll bet you'll wish you never let me live long enough to become a problem. You don't even know what you've just invited." The room fell silent for a moment. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, but Krall didn't move. Instead, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You are a prisoner, Norik," Krall said, his tone soft, almost intimate. "And if you think I'm going to spare you because of your ideas, you are gravely mistaken. I will break you." Ezra interrupted him, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm already broken, Krall. You don't understand. You don't have the faintest idea what humans are capable of when backed into a corner. If you think you've got me, you've already lost." Krall stood back, surprised by the sudden shift in Ezra's demeanor. For a brief moment, the Supreme Commander looked uncertain, as if trying to gauge whether this was some sort of trick. But there was no trick. Ezra was not afraid. Fear had no place in his world anymore. "I've seen your kind fall before," Ezra continued, his voice steady, almost amused. "I've watched empires crumble under their own weight. Yours will be no different." Krall scoffed, turning his back to Ezra. Enough of this. I've wasted too much time with you. You'll learn in time that resistance is futile. Ezra leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with something that could have been either defiance or amusement. You think I'm just a frail old man, don't you? You think this is all over before it begins? Well, let me give you one last piece of advice, Krall. The Vrekian turned back, his interest piqued. You want war, Ezra said, his voice suddenly cold and piercing. You'll get war. And when it comes, don't say I didn't warn you. The Supreme Commander's eyes narrowed dangerously. You dare. Ezra didn't let him finish. You may be able to break my body, Krall. But you'll never break my mind. And that's where you'll find your mistake. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Krall looked down at Ezra as if trying to decipher whether this old human was bluffing. He wasn't. Ezra had no more cards to play, but that didn't mean he had lost. He had planted a seed. And the seed would grow. With a sharp nod to his soldiers, Krall turned and walked out of the cell, the door sliding shut with a finality that seemed almost anticlimactic. Ezra remained seated, his eyes following the path of the retreating commander. The game had just begun. The hum of the Vrekian warship was almost soothing to Ezra. It reminded him of the quiet before a storm, the calm that precedes the chaos. But unlike the typical human soldiers he'd once led, the storm inside him wasn't about to be tamed. It simmered. Quiet. Calculated. Alone in his cell, Ezra leaned back against the cold, hard wall. He knew they thought they had won. He could hear the footsteps of Vrekian guards passing by his door, the harsh whisper of their tongues as they spoke about his impending execution. They had underestimated him, just like every other empire that had fallen before them. The Vrekian Empire was no different. They thought brute strength and sheer numbers would crush humanity. But Ezra Norik wasn't just another human. He was the sharp edge of the sword that had cut down countless foes, some of them far more powerful than Krall. Ezra's lips curled into a thin smile as he stood up. His limbs were stiff from sitting too long, but the pain was familiar. He had endured worse. He wasn't interested in breaking out of his cell, not yet. He didn't need to. The true battle was far more subtle than brute force. A soft beep echoed through the room, followed by the faint whir of a hidden mechanism activating. His eyes darted to the small ventilation shaft in the far corner. He had prepared for this moment. He had known they would underestimate him, and now, he would turn that underestimation into a weapon. A tiny, metal device slid out of the vent, gliding soundlessly onto the floor. Ezra moved swiftly, his fingers brushing over the device as he knelt to pick it up. A piece of technology he had smuggled in during his initial mission. He wasn't sure who in the ranks of the Vrekian ship had aided him, perhaps a sympathetic engineer or an agent planted by the human resistance. But it didn't matter now. With steady hands, Ezra activated the device, watching the screen light up with a series of encrypted codes. It wasn't much, just a fragment of the Vrekian military's vast communication system. But it was enough. A message blinked across the screen, access granted. Commencing data transfer. Ezra's heart quickened, but his face remained impassive. He had a plan. An hour later, Supreme Commander Krall stood in front of a large holographic display, studying the fleet movements of his forces. The light from the display cast eerie shadows across his scaly features. His eyes narrowed as he watched the incoming data. A communication alert flickered on the screen. Krall's brow furrowed as he tapped the console. What is this? His voice was low, a growl that betrayed his irritation. Sir, one of his officers said, glancing nervously at the screen. This is an unexpected transmission. It appears to be coming from the lower levels of the ship. Unauthorized. Krall's hand slammed onto the console, a warning to the officer. Put it through. A series of beeps filled the room as the transmission established its link. The hologram shimmered for a moment before stabilizing. Krall's eyes widened as a familiar face appeared before him, Ezra Norik. Ezra! Krall spat, a venomous hiss. I should have known. You're more trouble than you're worth. Ezra's face was calm, almost serene. You wanted war, Crawl. I'm giving it to you. You might want to check your fleet's coordinates. Someone's been playing with your orders. For a split second, the silence that followed felt as though it could stretch forever. Crawl's mind raced, analyzing the threat. A glitch? Sabotage? His eyes flicked to his officer. Check the fleet status, he ordered, his voice tight. Already doing it, sir. The officer responded, his fingers flying over the controls. His expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Commander, the 5th and 6th fleets, they've received false orders. They're moving toward uncharted space. They're vulnerable, Commander. Ezra's voice broke the tension. I've sent them on a nice little detour. The good news for you, Crawl, is that they're still alive. The bad news is that they're about to become very, very expendable. Crawl's fist clenched, but Ezra continued undeterred. I'm a little too old to play by your rules. But I know the game well enough. I've seen how you operate, Crawl. You make sure your enemies can't escape, can't hide. But you leave gaps. Big gaps. Gaps you're going to wish you hadn't left. I've got those gaps in my sights. Enough! Crawl snarled, his claws gouging the console as he swiped it aside. If I catch you. You will, Ezra interrupted smoothly. But I'd advise you to hurry. Time's running out. Back in his cell, Ezra watched the hologram fade as Crawl's image was replaced by static. The transmission had done its job. Crawl was rattled, his focus now on damage control. Ezra had done more than just alter coordinates. He'd planted confusion in the heart of the Vrekian war effort, a small but critical distraction that would pull Crawl's attention away from the immediate threat, Ezra himself. But that was just the beginning. The fleets were now vulnerable, exposed. The human resistance had been preparing for this moment. It was time to start the next phase. Ezra moved swiftly, his fingers flying over a small control panel hidden in the corner of his cell. The slight vibrations he felt against his skin were the first sign that the plan was unfolding. The ship's internal systems began to change, rewiring themselves in ways that only someone with a deep understanding of Vrekian technology could manage. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was the architect of chaos. Meanwhile, Crawl's rage was palpable. His mind raced as he ordered his officers to scramble. I want every ship checked, every command confirmed. This human has made a mockery of me. But it was too late. Ezra had already moved. The human war machine might have been small, but it was relentless. It had a way of turning nothing into something. The smallest spark could set the galaxy on fire. And Ezra Norik had just lit the match.